At around 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, January 16th, 2025, I received a text from a friend informing me that David Lynch had just passed away. This news didn't exactly come out of the blue, as it was known that the filmmaker's health had taken a turn for the worse in recent years, but it still sent me into a state of shock. I had only started to explore Lynch's filmography a few years prior and still had much left to see by the time of his passing, but he had very quickly become a figure of great fascination for me. The phrase one of a kind is thrown around a lot these days, but rarely has it ever felt so appropriate as when used about David Lynch. He was one of the most distinctive artists to emerge across any medium in the 20th century. One of the highest honours a filmmaker can receive is their name being turned into an adjective. You've got Hitchcockian, Kubrickian, Spielbergian. And even if you've never seen any of his movies, you've probably heard the term Lynchian. Watching a David Lynch movie, it didn't matter if I couldn't understand what was going on, because his films could trigger an emotional response from me that no other filmmakers could replicate. One of the most unforgettable cinematic experiences I've ever had was seeing Mulholland Drive with my girlfriend for the first time at the Lighthouse Cinema. Unable to articulate what I was seeing, but knowing that it was impacting me on a deep, primal level that would always stick with me. Homer Simpson really said it the best.
Brilliant! I have absolutely no idea what's going on.
His films were beautiful nightmares I just kept returning to. And I was not alone. After receiving the news, I immediately opened Twitter to confirm what I'd just been told, and over the course of that evening, I saw an outpouring of grief on a level I hadn't seen for an artist since probably the death of David Bowie nearly a decade prior. This was a man whose work meant a great deal to a lot of people, and losing him was truly devastating. And so, Lynch's passing gave me the motivation I needed to finally finish his filmography. Over the past few months, I have been deeply immersed in the world of David Lynch, reading up on his life, catching up on all the movies I still had yet to see, watching any interviews I could find with him, and finally listening to my friends who have been urging me to get around to Twin Peaks for years. And the more I watched of his filmography, both the parts I'd already seen and the ones I was only now catching up on, the clearer it became that I needed to devote a video to it. I wasn't even sure at first what form this video was going to take, but what I really wanted to do was try and explain why Lynch's work resonates with me specifically. Now let me dive into the strange, unnerving, beautiful world of David Lynch.
For those of you experiencing this weather report audio only, you can't see that I'm holding a jar. What is the purpose of this jar? Why did I paint it this certain way?
I don't remember when exactly the first time I heard his name was. I probably just became aware of him through cultural osmosis as a teenager who was interested in cinema. But what I do know is that even before I'd seen a single thing that he'd made, I was as fascinated by David Lynch the man as I was by David Lynch the artist. This was a guy who launched an Oscar campaign for Laura Dern's performance in Inland Empire by camping on the side of Hollywood Boulevard with a live cow. He rescued 5 Woody Woodpecker dolls he saw hanging from a gas station, parting ways with them years later because he was starting to notice unpleasant traits developing in them. He spent the COVID-19 pandemic posting delightful daily weather reports to his YouTube channel. The point is, he was an eccentric. Hardly a surprise if you've seen any of his movies. And yet, for a man who made a name for himself by conjuring some of the most disturbing sequences and characters to ever hit the silver screen, pretty much everyone who's ever worked with him has described him as one of the sweetest, most charming gentlemen you could ever hope to meet.
Well, it's not that he's weird, he's just kind of so, apple pie in a way. He's real kind of straight in a way, which is kind of odd because it's that, that paradox. He seems so straight, but then he's got all these strange things going on in his head.
I was at a point where I'd been auditioning for 10 years and people could barely give you eye contact. But with David, he was just genuinely interested.
Before I really start going into his work, I feel like I need to talk about the man himself, his life and career.
Hello. We're all very happy to be here tonight. First of all, I'd like to introduce my boys. This is Chucko, and this is Buster, and this is Pete. I'm David Lynch, and this is Bob, and this is Dan.
David Keith Lynch was born in Missoula, Montana on January 20th, 1946, the eldest of 3 children. His mother Edwina was an English language tutor, and his father Donald was a research scientist working for the US Department of Agriculture, which meant the family would frequently have to move. Young Lynch showed artistic inclinations from an early age, and in the 9th grade, a conversation with a friend whose father was a painter made him truly consider for the first time that art could be his career, not simply a hobby. He would go on to meet this friend's father, who gifted him a copy of Robert Henry's book The Art Spirit, further inspiring young David to devote himself to what he would come to call the art life. After high school, Lynch attended the School of the Museum of the Fine Arts in Boston, but found the art school environment creatively restrictive and soon dropped out. He would later attend the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where his interests began to move from painting towards expressing himself through moving images with sound. In his book, Catching the Big Fish, Lynch writes, "I'm not always good with words, but cinema is its own language, and with it you can say so many things. You've got dialogue, you've got music, you've got sound effects, you have so many tools, and you can express a feeling and a thought that can't be conveyed any other way." And so he began making experimental short films, starting with the crude but striking piece 6 Men Getting Six times, and gradually getting more ambitious. It was around this time in the early 1970s that Lynch's sister Martha introduced him to transcendental meditation, which became one of the most important aspects of his life. Lynch became completely devoted to the movement, meditating twice a day for the remainder of his life, and eventually starting his own foundation to spread the practice further. He's often credited his meditation routine with helping him deal with the depression and anxiety that he struggled with for many years. He calls this depression and anxiety the suffocating rubber clown suit of negativity, and considered it a vise grip on an artist's creativity.
Now, these negative things like anger and depression and sorrow, they're beautiful things in a story, but they're like a poison to the filmmaker. They're a poison to the painter. They're a poison to creativity.
Lynch's first feature film, premiering in 1977, would be Eraserhead, a 90-minute surrealist quasi-horror film about a factory worker in an industrialist hellscape, partly inspired by Lynch's time living in urban Philadelphia, whose girlfriend gives birth to a grotesque mutant that howls incessantly. While it's something of a fool's errand to try and attach one singular meaning to a lot of Lynch's surrealist work, it does feel important to note that Lynch himself had become a father for the first time just a few years before this film went into production. With Eraserhead, Lynch established many of the elements that would become hallmarks of his work. Bizarre, disturbing imagery, a pervasive atmosphere of indescribable anxiety, and a meticulous soundscape designed to generate maximum discomfort from the audience. Upon its release to the general public, the film was met with some very strong responses.
I thought it was the ultimate suspense thriller. I kept waiting for something to happen and it never did.
So people want to give you a card?
Some inane, bizarre person with a disturbed mind wrote that film, and I did not enjoy it.
Very entertaining. Very lively film. Gosh, it was the best thing I've seen all year.
A lot of people dismissed it as pretentious, but it did quickly win over some fans, with Pink Flamingo's director and general provocateur John Waters being among its earliest champions. It also caught the attention of producer Jonathan Sanger, who at that time was developing The Elephant Man, about a heavily disfigured social outcast in 19th century London, for Mel Brooks's production company Brooks Films, and was in search of a director for it. After meeting with Lynch, both Brooks and Sanger decided that he was the perfect man for the job, and he was more than eager to do it for them. Although Eraserhead had actually done pretty well financially for such an esoteric work, the more accessible and straightforwardly emotional Elephant Man would prove to be Lynch's first truly mainstream success, earning acclaim from critics and audiences, receiving Oscar nominations for Best Picture and Director, and even finally pushing the Academy to start honoring makeup artists with their own category. Now Lynch was getting offers left and right, including one from George Lucas to direct Return of the Jedi. But he opted instead for a different sci-fi project, Universal's adaptation of Frank Herbert's Dune. Unfortunately, this would go on to be one of the less triumphant chapters in his career. Micromanaged by a studio who wanted this to be their answer to Star Wars and were completely uninterested in the source material's more nuanced ideas, Dune arrived in theaters heavily edited down from Lynch's 3-hour cut, disappointed many fans of the book, and just baffled those who had never read it. It was a box office bomb that Lynch himself has since written off as not being true to his vision, and while I'd like to say that it's actually some misunderstood masterpiece, it's really not. Sorry if this is a basic opinion, but Villeneuve's version's clear. Although, now that we have a proper adaptation of Dune that does actually get to the heart of what the source material is about, it is a little bit easier to appreciate this one as a sort of goofy curiosity. I like this slug guy from the Spacing Guild. He's just a goofy dude, and I appreciate him.
On Dune, I started selling out even in the script phase, knowing I didn't have Final Cut, and I sold out. So it was a slow dying the death and a terrible, terrible experience.
While a critical and commercial failure like Dune could easily have ended him, Lynch would bounce back by entering the phase of his career where he truly cemented himself as a singular artist. In 1986, he released Blue Velvet, a dark and provocative neo-noir which initially divided critics and scandalized audiences with its graphic content, but quickly won over some adoring fans. He would then take the world of television by storm with Twin Peaks, which he co-created with Mark Frost, centered on the mystery of murdered high schooler Laura Palmer in the eponymous town. While pretty much an instant phenomenon with its unique tone and memorable characters like the eccentric FBI agent Dale Cooper, Twin Peaks was a tumultuous production during which Lynch frequently clashed with network executives, resulting in him effectively stepping back from active involvement in the series during season 2, only returning to oversee the final few episodes before it was abruptly cancelled by the network, leaving audiences on a cliffhanger that went unresolved for 25 years. But more on that later. Throughout the 90s, Lynch continued to defiantly march to the beat of his own drum. He directed a loose adaptation of Barry Clifford's novel Wild at Heart, the abstract and dreamlike noir thriller Lost Highway, and returned to the world of Twin Peaks for a prequel film titled Fire Walk with Me. All three of these movies initially divided critics and failed at the box office, but have since been re-evaluated in later years. Fire Walk with Me in particular was eviscerated by critics and audiences alike, disappointing those who wanted closure for the series' story instead of a harrowing examination of abuse and exploitation. Although it's now rightly considered a masterpiece and one of Lynch's best films, at the time, Fire Walk with Me pretty much killed the Twin Peaks franchise for good. Or so it seemed. But again, more on that later. He rounded out the 90s with The Straight Story, which seems an oddly non-Lynchian project on the surface. A wholesome odyssey released by Disney about an old man traveling across America on a lawnmower to reconcile with his estranged brother who has just had a stroke. Lynch would only release 2 feature films during the 21st century, both of them dark and disturbing Hollywood-set fever dreams that laugh in the face of conventional narrative structure. The first, Mulholland Drive, was reworked from a TV pilot Lynch made that never aired, and was the first of his weird films in a while to actually get the critical praise it deserved upon its release. Even Roger Ebert, a longtime Lynch detractor, gave the film his perfect grade.
I'm telling you, I have given thumbs down to one David Lynch movie after another, and as I watched this film, I was completely fascinated by it and drawn into it and entertained by it and absorbed by it from beginning to end. I don't care what its source was, whether it was made for TV or whether it was made for David Lynch's home movies, it works.
The second, Inland Empire, is maybe the most abstract movie of Lynch's career. Essentially a 3-hour YouTube creepypasta shot in low-res digital video without a completed script. Also around this time, he started releasing more short-form creations to the internet. For example, this bizarre quote-unquote sitcom about a family of rabbits, which was partially incorporated into Inland Empire.
And you guys just get up and you stand right next to her, like this, and I got it. I got it. Yeah, and then start bouncing up and down.
Lynch's final major work would be Twin Peaks: The Return, a long-gestating revival of the series, with most of the original cast returning alongside new faces. And this time, every episode was directed by him. In classic David Lynch fashion, The Return was completely uninterested in giving audiences what they expected. The first 2 seasons' signature strangeness was dialed up to 11, while the heightened soap opera tone of the original was replaced by something colder and more meditative. It was really unlike anything seen on television before or since, and in many ways it felt like the culmination of Lynch's entire career. It featured many actors with whom he had collaborated on previous films, returned to ideas and motifs he'd been playing around with from his earliest works, and let him go absolutely hog wild on the weirdness front. It was 18 hours of pure, unfiltered David Lynch. I was 15 when this was airing, and I can only imagine how crazy it must have felt to experience it in real time.
Slap me. You're pissed off. Slap me.
I don't want to.
Oh, sweetheart.
After this, Lynch made a few short films, including one wherein he interrogates a monkey, and also had a memorable cameo as John Ford at the end of Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans. But the return would effectively prove to be his swan song. Rumors would persist of a secret project in the works, but these would inevitably be revealed as just that. Rumors. It is said that a few years ago he actually was trying to get something off the works, but he couldn't get funding for it because we live in the darkest timeline. In August 2024, he confirmed publicly that he had been diagnosed with emphysema after a lifetime of smoking, rendering him virtually housebound, although he remained in good spirits. 5 months later, he died from complications related to the condition after having to be evacuated from his home during the California wildfires. So that's basically the gist of David Lynch's life and career. I didn't want to go into overly extraneous detail because this video isn't really intended to be a biography, so sorry if it feels like I skimmed past a few things. But I really just wanted to give an impression of who he was and how he lived to provide some context for my discussion of his work. So now I'm going to discuss what exactly Lynchian even means.
I'm going to play Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and try to anyway. It's September 17, 2021, and if you can believe it, it's a Friday once again.
Damn good. The paradox of trying to describe David Lynch's work to someone who's never seen it is that there's really only one satisfactory adjective for it. Lynchian. It's a term that's often misused to just refer to anything weird, but really the definition is more specific than that. As IndieWire film critic David Ehrlich put it in a tweet following Lynch's passing, the term is so overused because it's a viscerally understandable word without any known synonyms, but one that helps to articulate the indescribable strangeness of our shared reality. I will be delving into some thematic analysis of Lynch's work in this section, but I also want to stress that a key aspect of the Lynchian style is that a lot of it really doesn't have an easy explanation. There are some scenes in his work that are just some of the most pure encapsulations of dream logic I've ever seen captured on film. I could never articulate why this scene from Twin Peaks' Fire Walk With Me is so viscerally unsettling to me, but it's seared into my mind nonetheless. He was famously adamant about not wanting to directly explain the more surreal aspects of his work, preferring instead for the audience to draw their own conclusions from it.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film.
Elaborate on that.
No, I won't.
There are common readings of Eraserhead, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire, and Twin Peaks The Return that do broadly make sense, but none of these even come close to explaining every bizarre or confusing thing that happens in them, and nor should they. What's most important about these works is how they make you feel. Even so, there are themes and ideas he's returned to over the course of his career that do form crucial aspects of the Lynchian style. By all accounts, Lynch did have a pretty happy childhood. Recalling his youth, he says, "It was a dream world. Those droning airplanes, blue skies, picket fences, green grass, cherry trees. Middle America as it was supposed to be. But then on the cherry tree, there would be this pitch oozing out, some of it black, some of it yellow, and there were millions of red ants racing all over the sticky pitch, all over the tree. So you see, there's this beautiful world, and you just look a little bit closer, and it's all red ants." This striking image would provide the basis for the opening scene of Blue Velvet, which feels like a thesis statement for Lynch's entire filmography, exploring the dark truths hidden by the happy exterior of Americana, whether it be the idealized white picket fence suburb or the glitz of LA, the artifice of the American dream peeled back and laid bare. In Blue Velvet, a suburban teenager discovers a grotesque underworld of violence and depravity within his own seemingly peaceful neighborhood. Mulholland Drive is perhaps the purest examination of the abyss lurking underneath Hollywood's glamorous exterior since Sunset Boulevard. In Twin Peaks, the shocking murder of Laura Palmer is no mere anomaly in an otherwise idyllic small-town community, but rather something that brings the rot and corruption that was already present there bubbling to the surface. In the documentary David Lynch, The Art Life, he recounts an anecdote from his childhood that has stuck in his mind ever since. One night, he was out late with his brother when a naked woman with a bloodied mouth came walking down the street and started crying in front of them. He describes the encounter with this woman as mysterious and dreamlike, and recalls wanting to help her in some way, but being too young to know what to do. This story sounds like it could be a scene from one of Lynch's films. Indeed, the character it immediately brings to mind is Dorothy Valens, the abused and tormented nightclub singer played by Isabella Rossellini in Blue Velvet, which does indeed feature a scene where she wanders naked down a suburban neighborhood at night in a state of emotional distress. Blue Velvet as a whole really feels like it's drawing on that childhood experience. Even though the protagonist Jeffrey Beaumont is a teenager as opposed to a young child, he is, like young Lynch in that moment, being confronted with the cruelty and violence masked by the picturesque suburban environment he has grown up in. Lynch is especially preoccupied with the violence, often of a sexual nature, that men inflict upon women. We see this with Frank Booth in Blue Velvet, with Bobby Peru in Wild at Heart, with Killer Bob in Twin Peaks. But the important thing to understand about Lynch's worldview is that he's not some misanthrope who believes the world is full of nothing but death and suffering and violence. And he's not depicting such horrors simply to sadistically revel in them, but rather because he himself is deeply troubled by the presence of such evil in the world. One of the most important scenes in Blue Velvet sees a dismayed Jeffrey asking why there are people as monstrous and depraved as Frank, a question that Lynch himself seems to be wrestling with. Jeffrey's love interest Sandy can only respond by recounting a dream she had in which love, represented by robins, ultimately triumphed over the oppressive darkness plaguing the world. This monologue is a genuinely magical, moving moment delivered beautifully by Laura Dern, who incidentally is introduced in the movie as this angelic figure emerging from the shadows, herself a beacon of innocence and beauty amidst overwhelming darkness. In the final scene of the movie, after Frank has been defeated and life is returning to some semblance of normality for the characters, we see a robin sitting on a windowsill. It's a visibly artificial robin, which leads some to interpret the image as ironic, but I really don't know that I agree. Lynch may not fully buy into the idea of this quiet suburban neighborhood as some kind of perfect paradise, but he does fundamentally believe that love can persevere in the face of darkness. The robin may be artificial, but what it represents can still be made real. John Merrick in The Elephant Man endures unimaginable cruelty at the hands of his fellow man, but he encounters kindness as well, and his story becomes an ode to the power of the human spirit. Wild at Heart depicts a world full of violence and brutality, but it's also an unabashedly romantic movie that ends with Glinda the Good Witch appearing before the protagonist and convincing him that his love is worth fighting for. Fire Walk with Me, a contender for the most upsetting movie I've ever seen, ends with Laura Palmer in the afterlife being confronted with the comforting image of an angel watching over her. Even his fascination with showing the ugly side of Americana shouldn't be mistaken for a blanket dismissal of the notion that there's any truth to be found in its ideals. Again, he has recalled fond memories of his own childhood growing up in these environments. He doesn't despise them. Perhaps that's even what drove him to make The Straight Story, a movie that certainly doesn't sugarcoat the everyday struggles faced by those in small-town America, but still uncynically celebrates the genuine beauty he observes in its communities. A lot of people joke about how weird it is that the same director could make Blue Velvet and The Straight Story, but I would argue that it's actually Lynch's fundamental belief in humanity's inherent capacity for kindness and compassion that also enables him to explore evil and decay so vividly. These two sides of Lynch don't contradict one another, but rather feed into each other and strengthen each other's profundity. The other important thing to remember about Lynch's work is that for all the talk of how fucked up it can be, he's also really funny.
You've been there all through the years, Lucy?
Actually, I have gone home, and Andy and I have taken some vacations. One year we went to Bora Bora.
There's a lot of talk about the offbeat humor and eccentric character in Twin Peaks, but his sense of humor also comes through in the likes of Mulholland Drive and Lost Highway, never undercutting the darkness, but always adding to the uncanny vibe. As is usually the case, to truly understand what makes Lynch such a singular artist, you really have to look at the works that try and fail to replicate his style. Take, for perhaps the most overt example, the episodes of Twin Peaks made during his departure from the show. There's some good stuff in these episodes, but for the most part his absence is sorely felt, not least in the moments where the show tries to replicate the idiosyncratic tone he perfected. Lynch didn't direct every episode prior to his departure, but his creative influence could still absolutely be felt. While he's gone, we get stuff like the Ben Horn Confederacy arc and Nadine the superpowered high schooler, which just feel willfully weird instead of hypnotically dreamlike like the best parts of Season 1 and the first half of Season 2. And then there's Blonde, Andrew Dominik's controversial 2022 film depicting a heavily fictionalized vision of Marilyn Monroe's life. The influence of David Lynch on Blonde is pretty much undeniable. There's a bit of Mulholland Drive in its exploration of the darkness lurking under Hollywood's pristine surface, but the Lynch project that it owes the most to is Fire Walk With Me. Both films are centered on abused young women failed by the world around them, using expressionistic storytelling to convey their protagonists' tortured states of mind. Blonde's score by Nick Cave and Warren Ellis even feels like it's very much trying to evoke Angelo Badalamenti's work on Twin Peaks. Both movies are incredibly tough watches that put their protagonists through hell. But where Fire Walk With Me is a deeply moving work that has resonated with many survivors of abuse who feel a connection with the character of Laura Palmer, Blonde feels mean-spirited, gratuitous, and smug in how it depicts Marilyn Monroe. Both of these are stories of abused women directed by straight men who are technically proficient filmmakers, so why does one feel so exploitative while the other doesn't? The answer really comes down to one word: empathy. Let's go back to the scene in Blue Velvet where Lynch recreates his childhood memory of the naked woman wandering down the street with Dorothy Valens. This moment is perhaps the most obvious example of how that childhood experience made its way into Lynch's art, but it's not the only one. A recurring theme in his work is the motif of, as the tagline for Inland Empire put it, a woman in trouble. You've got Dorothy in Blue Velvet, Lula in Wild at Heart, Diane in Mulholland Drive, Nikki in Inland Empire, and of course, Laura Palmer in Twin Peaks. All of these are women who are failed by the world around them, who are exploited and spat out by the patriarchal society that they live in. But Lynch doesn't gratuitously marinate in their suffering, no more than he does with John Merrick in The Elephant Man. Dorothy Valens is an incredibly tragic, traumatized figure, but she is ultimately allowed some catharsis. Not all of the women in Lynch's films are so lucky in that way, but you can still feel his deep empathy for them even in the darkest moments. Blonde, on the other hand, is pure misery porn. Dominik's comments during the promotional tour displayed a dismissive, patronizing, and downright ignorant attitude towards Marilyn Monroe that comes through in the work. He may be commenting on how his subject was exploited and objectified by the world, but he doesn't seem remotely interested in her as a human being, instead defining her solely by her relationships to the shitty men in her life. Fire Walk With Me works because it centers Laura, and allows her some agency even as it barrels towards the inevitable, devastating conclusion of her demise. As a side note, Cheryl Lee gives one of the greatest screen performances I've ever seen here, and it's a travesty that she didn't go on to have a better career after Twin Peaks. Where Blonde takes a complicated, intelligent, and charismatic real-life person and reduces her to nothing more than an object to be passed around and tortured, Fire Walk With Me takes a character who for 2 seasons of television we only knew as an abstract concept, a symbol of stolen innocence filtered through other characters' perceptions of her, and gets us to know the fully rounded, empathetic, beautiful person that she was. Andrew Dominik hardly seems to care about Marilyn Monroe, but David Lynch loves Laura Palmer.
Why did you decide to make a prequel to Twin Peaks?
Because I sort of fell in love with the idea of seeing Laura Palmer walking and talking, and I love the idea of visiting her in her last days.
To round out this part of the discussion, I want to talk about Escape from Tomorrow. For those of you that don't know, this was a low-budget production filmed covertly at Disney World, purporting to explore the dark truths hidden underneath the happiest place on Earth. It's a pretty impressive feat of production, but it is not a good movie. It's a shallow exercise in edgelord cinema whose attempts to be weird and provocative are just tiresome, and which never has anything meaningful to say. Escape from Tomorrow is another movie that fails to understand Lynch's relationship to misogyny on screen. Throughout the movie, the sexually frustrated main character is shown leering at pretty much every female character he comes across that isn't his wife, such as these 2 French teenagers. Now, obviously, the act of depicting this is not in and of itself misogynistic. It's not as if the movie is saying its protagonist is right for being a sleazy pervert. But the problem is that there's no discernible point being made here about misogyny or the male gaze or anything. It feels as if the movie is just going off the logic of depicting women through a sexualized lens is inherently deep and artistic, which I think is a trap that a lot of film students seeking to emulate directors like Lynch fall into. None of the women in this movie are allowed to be characters or, God forbid, figures we're invited to empathize with. They're just a collection of misogynistic stereotypes. The nagging wife, the crazy seductress, the objects of desire. You really don't get the sense that director Randy Moore has a very high opinion of women, which is at least part of what separates him from David Lynch. Watching all these failed Lynch imitators really makes you realize how miraculous his oeuvre feels. It could so easily be exploitative, sleazy, and mean-spirited. Yet even as he depicts horrors both eldritch and grounded, I find that there's a strong undercurrent of humanity running throughout his work. That humanity is obviously on full display in the likes of The Elephant Man and The Straight Story, but it's even present in something as desperately sad and terrifying as Mulholland Drive. The power of Lynch's work lies in the visceral feelings it leaves in the pit of your stomach. Yes, discomfort, confusion, and despair, but also warmth and even a macabre sense of comfort. Nobody could capture all these feelings in quite the same way that David Lynch does.
I'm wearing dark glasses today because I'm seeing the future and it's looking very bright.
Lynch's work is sometimes dismissed by those who have either never seen it or only ever engaged with it on a surface level as being nothing more than film bro cinema that appeals to straight white male film students and nobody else.
What the hell?
Obviously, that's an incurious and lazy way of engaging with art in general, but it's a particularly ignorant thing to say about David Lynch, because the truth is, a not insignificant portion of his fanbase is comprised of young queer women and non-binary people. That was very apparent as I scrolled through my social media feed after I learned of his passing. I saw countless tributes from LGBTQ people talking about how much his work meant to them, some even crediting it with saving their lives at a time when they felt desperately alone. It was something I'd observed even before his death, really. I've seen many short films by young LGBTQ artists that feel very much like the work of someone deeply inspired by David Lynch. Lynch was, to the very best of our knowledge, a heterosexual man. So what exactly is it about his work that resonates so deeply with queer audiences in particular? Well, to get the obvious out of the way, I should talk about Twin Peaks. More specifically, the character of Denise Bryson, the transgender DEA agent introduced in the second season. Although played by the cisgender David Duchovny, it's hard to deny how impactful Denise was to a lot of young queer Twin Peaks fans when the show was airing. This was the early 90s, a time when trans women in media were pretty much exclusively used for either shock value or abject mockery. So yes, it was pretty radical for a network television show to feature a completely sympathetic and dignified portrayal of a trans person. For a certain demographic of viewers who were still discovering themselves as they watched the show, this was the first time that they saw positive, non-judgmental trans representation on screen. I should note that Denise was introduced in the period during which Lynch was less involved in the show, but nevertheless he does bring her back for one scene in The Return, where his character Gordon Cole delivers a line that became a rallying cry at every Pride event after the episode aired.
And when you became Denise, I told all your colleagues, those clown comics, to fix their hearts or die.
But Denise, cool as she is only in a small handful of Twin Peaks episodes. Yes, as we've established, she made a lot of trans viewers feel truly seen for the first time, but the real reason that Lynch's work has amassed such a dedicated queer following goes a lot deeper than simply representation. And for the record, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that that aspect of it was always perfect either. Like, Dune doesn't exactly tone down the unfortunate homophobic subtext of how Frank Herbert characterizes Baron Harkonnen. The real reason Lynch's work resonates so deeply with queer people is because even though he himself was straight, a lot of the core themes in his art are just intrinsically queer. The Elephant Man is a movie about a person on the fringes of quote-unquote respectable society who is judged and ostracized by a world that fears anything remotely different. The famous scene where he begs for people to just respect his humanity, the bare minimum that a person should be able to expect from his fellow man, unsurprisingly resonates with a community that even today faces relentless persecution from those who want to banish them from society.
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
Laura Palmer is outwardly the epitome of the all-American prom queen sweetheart from a seemingly happy middle-class family, but she lives with a constant inner turmoil that she's never truly able to share with anyone, even her closest friend. Again, the character herself isn't queer, or even intentionally coded as such, but hers is still a journey that a lot of queer people can broadly empathize with. The scene in Fire Walk With Me, where her father Leland cruelly badgers her over her dirty hands, portrays a scenario all too familiar to a lot of closeted teenagers. A parental figure whom they're supposed to be able to trust and confide in, making them feel judged and ashamed over some small perceived imperfection, removing the sense of safety that they should be able to feel in their own home. A core characteristic of the idealized white picket fence suburban society that Lynch spent so much of his career deconstructing is the oppressive, suffocating force of heteronormativity and rigid traditional gender roles that were so central to the classic idea of the American dream. For many queer kids, whether they be questioning their sexuality or their gender, to be raised in such an environment is to grow up with an increasingly pervasive sense of anxiety that something is deeply wrong with either you or the reality you inhabit. And what filmmaker better captures that feeling than David Lynch? Returning to the topic of movies clearly influenced by Lynch, one of the more successful examples in recent memory is my favorite film from last year, I Saw the TV Glow, which filters those very themes through a more explicitly queer lens. I don't want to define director Jane Schoenbrunn solely as a filmmaker influenced by Lynch, because they are first and foremost a singular artistic voice in their own right, and their work absolutely stands on its own. I Saw the TV Glow is also less abstract about its ultimate meaning than a lot of Lynch's work. If you know anything about Schoenbrunn's background, it's pretty easy to figure out that this is a movie about gender dysphoria. Still, they've been very open about how much David Lynch's work has meant to them, and this movie is one of the few examples of a non-Lynch film I've seen that even comes close to capturing the sense of existential dread and emotional devastation that I get from his work. It's not just the otherworldly vibe that permeates even the most mundane conversations between characters, or its portrayal of a sinister and foreboding suburban environment, or the musical performances which feel like more shoegazy versions of the Roadhouse sequences from Twin Peaks: The Return. It's the haunting combination of nightmarish surrealism with deeply felt empathy that feels the most Lynchian here. I single out I Saw the TV Glow as an example because, of course, the idea of feeling a deep personal connection to a work of art and it showing you a window into a world where you can truly be free as yourself is literally what this movie is about. And there's just something deeply moving about seeing a filmmaker who was drawn to Twin Peaks in a similar way to how their protagonist is drawn to the show within the film, exploring those ideas in a way that feels so indebted to Lynch without coming across as pure pastiche. Schoenbrunn is far from the only queer filmmaker to cite Lynch as a major inspiration. Vera Drew, the trans filmmaker behind last year's The People's Joker, posted a moving tribute to him on her social media, in which she described how his art made her feel safe in her skin as a queer woman and drove her to want to make films. Portrait of a Lady on Fire director Celine Sciamma cited her first viewing of Fire Walk With Me in 1992 as a formative experience that changed the way she looked at cinema. The drag queen Katia is a known Twin Peaks fanatic who pays tribute to the show at every available opportunity. I have no idea if Lynch ever knew how much of an icon he'd become to the queer community, but I'm sure he would have been flattered if somebody had told him.
You have a very good heart, and you are interested in other human beings. You make people feel at ease, and you're very intelligent, and you have a very good heart.
I bring all this up because to me, this is one of the most beautiful aspects of Lynch's legacy. His work helped give a voice to the outsiders, gave them the language they needed to articulate the primal terror and anxiety they felt moving through the world, and made them feel less alone. Part of the reason he never wanted to over-explain his work was because he knew the things people brought to it would be more meaningful than him simply stating what he wanted them to think. And I think that's perfectly demonstrated by the devoted queer following his movies have amassed. When I started delving into David Lynch's filmography in 2022, I held on to a small shred of hope that maybe in the next few years he would release that mythical last feature film. That I would get the experience of watching a new David Lynch movie in cinemas at least once in my life. It is sad that that's no longer something I can even naively hope for, but really, the body of work that he leaves behind is enough of a miracle on its own. From Eraserhead to Twin Peaks: The Return, Lynch managed to capture the sometimes frightening, sometimes beautiful strangeness of moving through the world like few others could. He was an artist full of contradictions that only enhanced his work, and a filmmaker who reshaped how I saw the possibilities of the medium. So in honor of the great man, I leave you with these words. Keep your eye on the donut, not on the hole.
Thank you. My pleasure.